And so the Jeffersonians thought it would be absurd and ridiculous to put, say, 5 government lawyers appointed for life in charge of everybody's liberty. But of course, that's where we've been ever since the 1860s. I quoted Woodrow Wilson in my new book as pointing out in his book on congressional government that he wrote when he was a professor, that 1865 marked sort of the point of demarcation where the federal government did become the sole arbiter of the limits of its own powers through the Supreme Court. Judicial review had existed, of course, for a long time, but a lot of politicians thumbed their noses at it. Andrew Jackson, when the Supreme Court said the Bank of the United States is constitutional, many of you are probably familiar with his famous response where he said, Mr. Marshall has made his decision, now let him try to enforce it. And so it wasn't a foregone conclusion that what I think of as the black-robed deities of the Supreme Court were to tell us what our liberties are. The people themselves laid a claim on that. And so I think the overthrowing of this view of the Constitution, citizen control of the central government through political communities that could practice nullification or secession, that was all ended in the 1860s. And so what was destroyed was not only the voluntary union of the founders, but the Jeffersonian view of the Constitution. And there were only remnants left of it after that. And I think, of course, the final nails in the coffin occurred in 1913 with the Fed, the income tax, and the direct election of senators, the 17th Amendment. And so all power, not all power, but almost all power was centralized in Washington, D.C. Thereafter, the states became essentially franchises of the central government. And the meaning of this, I think, a lot of you are familiar, I'm sure every one of you is familiar with the famous saying by Lord Acton about how power corrupts. But I gave a talk at a conference in Arlington a couple of weeks ago and gave me the occasion to actually look up the full quote from Lord Acton about power corrupts. And I'm betting that a lot of you haven't ever seen the actual full quote, because the context was he was talking about the centralization of power, not just power per se, but the centralization or consolidation, as the founders said, of power. And he said this, he said, and remember, I'm quoting, where you have a concentration of power in a few hands, all too frequently men with the mentality of gangsters get control. History has proven that. All power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely, end quote. And so it wasn't just power, it was the consolidation of power in a relatively few hands. And in my new book, I make the case that, maybe it's not news to those of you, that all the worst tyrants in world history have been enemies of divided sovereignty, or you could call it states' rights, you could call it federalism. And I even have some quotations of Adolf Hitler in there. I guess maybe I'll quote Hitler today. So I bet nobody has quoted Adolf Hitler yet at the Future of Freedom Foundation conference. And the reason why I have a Hitler quote in some of my writings was when I debated Harry Jaffa on the Lincoln question about 5 years ago, I anticipated that he would eventually get around to finding a way of calling me a Nazi, because I had known that anytime he had ever debated anybody else on this question, that's what he did. He's always accused his opponents, his intellectual opponents, of being Nazis or white supremacists or some sort of odious character. And sure enough, he came through. He did it in a roundabout way. And so what I did the next day when I got home, this was at the Independent Institute in Oakland, by the way, and David Thoreau is sitting over there somewhere. And I had actually taken a course in European history in college, and I remember, and I read Mein Kampf. And so I went to the library and checked out Mein Kampf and brought it home in a brown paper bag. And because I remember there's a chapter in it on states' rights, federalism, and so forth. And so I wrote an article for Lew Rockwell's website entitled something like Jaffa's Hitlerian Defense of Lincoln, or something like that. And sure enough, my memory hadn't failed yet, because I remember that Adolf Hitler himself went on and on and on about the evil of state sovereignty. And he said things like, I'll just read you a few things here. He said, the National Socialists would totally eliminate states' rights altogether, since for us the state is such is only a form, but the essential is its content, the nation, the people. It is clear that everything else must be subordinated to its sovereign interests. And he also, I didn't remember this, but he also cites Lincoln's first inaugural address to make Hitler's case for the abolition of states' rights in Germany. And of course, every tyrant knows that you can't be a tyrant or a despot with competing sovereignties. And so if there's any competing sovereignties, whether it's the church or local government, they must be eliminated. And so in my latest book, I cite what Lincoln had to say in his first inaugural address, denying the historical fact of state sovereignty, the states ratifying the Constitution. And then I quote Hitler's rendition of what Lincoln said in his first inaugural address. So all the worst tyrants of 20th century history were enemies of decentralized power, and all the champions of liberty did the opposite. For example, Ludwig von Mises, I'll just give you one more quote. In his book, Omnipotent Government, when he's talking about the growth of government and how government's growth is always the enemy of liberty, he says this, quote, "It is a very significant fact that the adversaries of the trend toward more government control describe their opposition as a fight against Washington and against Bern," he was referring to Switzerland, i.e. against centralization. "It is conceived as a contest of states' rights versus the central power," end quote. So you have champions of liberty like Ludwig von Mises who always understood that's where the game is. That's where, in terms of defending liberty, if we can't have zero government, we need to decentralize it as much as possible, and because that's how we weaken it, and that's how we at least maximize or attempt to maximize liberty. Edmund Wilson, in a book of his called Patriotic Gore, had a little passage in there where he said that Lincoln, Lenin, and Bismarck did more than any single individuals in their respective countries to introduce centralized governmental bureaucracy. Now, he's not saying that Lincoln was exactly like Lenin, of course. I've been accused of saying that. Lincoln was much worse, as you know, who's read those who have read my articles. But it is true that, and I would argue that these three men did more than any single individuals in ushering in, introducing centralized governmental bureaucracies in their respective countries, which all played out in very different ways, but it is certainly true. Some other reasons why the enemies of liberty love Lincoln, in addition to the fact that he was a champion of consolidation, monopoly government, in other words. Well, there are several very good books on Lincoln and civil liberties. My favorite is Freedom Under Lincoln by Dean Sprague. There's one called Constitutional Problems Under Lincoln by James Randall. And James Randall was the preeminent Lincoln scholar of the last generation. Fate of Liberty by Mark Neely. He's also a Lincoln supporter, as is Randall, but there's a lot of good facts in there. And just last year, there was a book published called Lincoln's Wrath by Jeffrey Manber and a co-author. And it has a big, long subtitle, and part of the subtitle is A President's Mission to Destroy the Press, end quote. And it's recommended to anybody. And of course, it was mentioned by Ivan in the last talk that Lincoln's, well, if you read these books, you find out that he shut down over 300 northern newspapers and censored the telegraphs. To give you an idea of the type of quality of Lincoln scholarship, for example, though, on this issue, I was in a panel discussion of this in Richmond a few years ago, and there were some pro-Lincoln and Lincoln critics like me on the other side of the panel, and one of the Lincoln defenders dug up one quote from a northern newspaper in 1864 that was critical of Lincoln, and he thought that was proof that this is all a lie, that he didn't censor the press at all. And of course, he didn't say whether or not that paper was permitted to continue publishing or not, but that typically is what happened. If you criticize the regime, things that happened was you were shut down or you were denied access to the mails. All the newspapers were mailed in those days, and the paper boy was not invented yet, I suppose, from what I've read. Or you had groups of thugs, Republican Party thugs, who would come, including soldiers, who would come and smash your printing presses. A lot of that went on also.